Okay, good afternoon. I had a different title for this. It was going to be Forest Science in a Changing World, but my graduate student told me that wasn't very riveting. So I found this cover of Time magazine, I think better explains the research that I'll be talking briefly about today with you. And if you want any more information on the research, I also have a website here at the bottom that has more details if you're interested. Well, first I'll give a little bit of background on climate change and forests, and then I'd like to talk specifically about a project to develop tools for ecological forestry and carbon management in longleaf pine. I think everybody knows about the greenhouse effect. Radiation or energy from the planet escapes the atmosphere as long-wave radiation or infrared radiation, but some of it is trapped by greenhouse gases, including CO2, methane, nitrous oxides, and water vapor. And that's depicted here by the molecules floating around in the outer atmosphere. So greenhouse gases basically trap long-wave radiation or heat in the atmosphere. And for the past about 800,000 years, this is a very small window in the Earth's history, but CO2 concentrations have oscillated between about 170 parts per million and at most 300 parts per million. But we know there's been a pretty rapid increase since the Industrial Revolution in CO2 concentrations to over 400 parts per million. It's predicted that we may reach 800 parts per million by the end of the century. So what does that mean? Well, you've heard about the greenhouse effect and how it may increase global temperatures. But just to bring it home a little bit to the southeast, some models predict that the number of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit will increase substantially between the period of 2041 and 2070. For example, depending on the model and where you live in the southern United States, we could see an increase of more than 50 days a year above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty significant warming. This is a diagram here of the short-term global carbon cycle to give you an idea of where CO2 is coming from and where it's being mitigated. Humans emit about 9 gigatons, which is about 1 billion metric tons of CO2 a year from use of fossil fuels, cement production, and land use change, primarily deforestation. The oceans absorb about 2 gigatons, and then photosynthesis offsets about 3 gigatons a year. So about a third of our emissions are offset by the process of photosynthesis in plants and forests. Where does carbon go in the process of photosynthesis? Well, it's fixed into plant parts such as leaves, the stem, the branches. Some of those plant parts are longer lived than others, for instance, the bole and the branches and coarse roots below ground, and some is incorporated into the soil. So through the process of photosynthesis, trees sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So they tie it up in their plant biomass. Forest growth provides an important carbon sink. This is just a map here of biomass production for different forests throughout the United States in tons of carbon per hectare per year. So when forests grow and produce biomass, they sequester carbon. You can see that in the southern United States, we have pretty high sequestration rates, as well as Pacific Northwest forests sequester a lot of carbon, and in the Appalachian Mountains as well. So forests, again, offset about 15% of annual carbon emissions that the U.S. produces per year. It's not a whole lot, but it's something. So forests can serve as a means of mitigating CO2, climate change, by sequestering CO2 in plant biomass, detritus, and in the soil. The southern forests contain about 36% of the sequestered forest carbon in the United States. So the southern United States is a pretty big carbon sink. But we have a need for assessment of carbon sequestration in a variety of ecosystems under different management scenarios and climate change scenarios. So I'd like to talk specifically about a project where we're developing tools to assess ecological forestry and carbon management on longleaf pine ecosystems. The project was funded for over $2 million by the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program in the Department of Defense, which has big bucks, and I'll explain why those big bucks are important in a minute. This is a list of collaborators at other institutions. So why longleaf pine? Well, longleaf pine is a dominant forest type on most military installations in the southeast. The forest is very low density and open, so it facilitates military training. Troops can get in, equipment can maneuver in the open areas. Longleaf pine is a fire-dependent ecosystem, so live rounds from military training are not a big deal if fires are set. In addition, the military is charged with conserving biodiversity, and longleaf pine ecosystems harbor a lot of plant and animal biodiversity, for instance, like the red-cockaded woodpecker. Longleaf pine ecosystems were once a dominant ecosystem in the southeastern United States. They now occupy about 3% of their original range. Their restoration is currently popular. There's a lot of interest in ecosystem restoration for not only traditional wood products, but also a variety of ecosystem services, and as a species that's expected to be more resilient to disturbances associated with future climate change. Also, it's a long-lived conifer. Most of our conifers live about 200 years. Longleaf pine can live over 400 years. So the potential for carbon sequestration in tree biomass is extended in this species. So specifically, we have a lot of objectives, but I'm only going to give you two. And the first one is to develop and link carbon models that can assess forest restoration or longleaf pine restoration over time. And the second is to collect the data to parameterize those models and validate those models. Typically what we do in longleaf pine restoration is we plant an even age system, and then over time we manage it through selective harvest and burning into an uneven age system, where you have a variety of tree ages and tree structures and forest structures and high level of biodiversity. So we developed a modeling system to address both of those phases of restoration. This is just a quick slide to show you that the models are fairly complicated, even though the data I'm going to show you are fairly simplistic. The models consider both forest management, forest structure, allometric relationships to predict carbon sequestration based on forest structure, and then a consideration of the carbon costs of forest management. And there's more of this on the website if you're interested. So this is an example of a simulation produced by the model where in situ and ex situ carbon stocks can be simulated over time. Carbon into different forest products can be simulated. Carbon in different ecosystem pools can be assimilated, and then the amount of carbon that's emitted from silvicultural operations can be also detailed. So model parameterization was conducted over 20 stands throughout the southern United States. The gray here indicates the range of longleaf pines. So we studied carbon pools at 4 different military installations and created what's called a 100-year carbon chronosequence. So we studied forests ranging in age from 5 years of age to about 120. We did detailed assessments of carbon in different stocks, including above and below ground biomass, detritus, the understory, and soils. We, meaning the guys that are sitting right here in that back row, cut down about 127 trees to develop allometric equations that I'll explain in a minute, and then excavated the stumps below ground to get at carbon that's stored in the taproot and lateral roots, which you can imagine is quite labor-intensive work. Very labor-intensive. That's my riveting part. And so from that very simplistic, very labor-intensive, expensive data collection, we developed allometric models to be able to predict mass and subsequently carbon mass based on easy-to-measure parameters such as height, in this case, and diameter. So we developed these models to be able to predict from height and diameter biomass in different tissues and subsequently carbon. We also used ground-penetrating radar. I don't know if anybody watched public TV this past weekend when they had a piece on finding Shakespeare with ground-penetrating radar. But ground-penetrating radar was, I think, developed during World War II. And we use it to assess root biomass below ground. Ground-penetrating radar, roots make hyperbolic reflections that are detected by ground-penetrating radar. And when coupled with root coring, we can create what's called root maps, such as this, where you can see that near trees, which is where these circles are, you see a high density of root biomass. So some results for our chronosequence. Well, we know longleaf pine has exceptional lateral taproot extension outside of our excavation pits. Our excavation pits were at the most 4 meters squared. There's evidence in the literature that roots can extend as much as 22 meters from the main stem. And we found indeed that ground penetrating radar assessment of lateral root carbon outside the excavation pits really increased our accounting of carbon below ground. This is live root carbon in megagrams per hectare versus stand age. This is with GPR assessment of lateral root carbon, and without, this is just with below stump. And you can see that it nearly doubled our assessment of live root C below ground. Root to shoot mass ratio is used in a lot of models, both global and regional, to predict below ground mass. Nobody wants to dig it up. It's far too intensive and destructive. So if we can have a measure of root to shoot ratio, we can predict it from above ground mass. So this is here is root to shoot ratio versus stand age over time for the different stands. This top line is including the ground penetrating radar assessment of live root C. If we exclude the youngest stand, which has a very high root to shoot ratio, we came up with an average of 0.52 compared to the range of 0.18 to 0.26 reported for a wide range of conifers across the globe. So exceptional coarse root accumulation of carbon in longleaf pine ecosystems is what we determined. That's the exciting part to us. That's quite extraordinary that there's that much carbon sequestered below ground in longleaf pine. We also looked at live tree C, which is above ground carbon in the chronosequence over time, and we fit a model to those data right here. And also went out to the last remaining, or what we think of as the last remaining old growth tract of longleaf pine, which is in Georgia, and it ranges in ages from 100 to 40 years of, the trees that range in age from 100 to 400 years of age, with a median age of 250. So we developed our model, and then we went out and measured using height and diameters, and then predicted biomass of this tract and see where it fit on our model. So we didn't use the data point in the model. You see the model did a pretty good job of predicting mass, live tree carbon mass for these old growth systems, so we're fairly confident with our model. Ecosystem carbon stocks, which include all stocks except soil, also increased with stand age with a predicted maximum of about 120, 119 megagrams of carbon per hectare. At 100 years, ecosystem carbon stocks were 69% of the predicted maximum, indicating long-term carbon accumulation, and that ecosystem carbon stocks were dominated by the accumulation of live tree biomass. And finally, soil carbon. Most carbon is below ground. It doesn't change rapidly in response to forest management, but it is a large carbon pool globally. Soil carbon can exceed ecosystem carbon stocks, and we found that it did in younger longleaf pine stands, but we found no relationship with stand age, which supports other research that's shown that the rate of carbon accumulation in forests across the globe is more dependent on vegetation changes rather than soil carbon changes. So in conclusion, long-term carbon accumulation and tree above ground biomass combined with its larger than expected lateral root carbon accumulation indicates a role of longleaf pine ecosystems in sequestering carbon and in offsetting the rapid accumulation and removal of carbon associated with plantations that you normally see in the southern United States. If you want more information about the project, CERTIP has a really good website that details all their projects as well as their funding opportunities, which is always good to know because they fund a wide variety of research, not just biological forestry research, but chemical research, pollution research. So it's a really good program. If you want more information on the models, they're posted online at the University of Florida. And with that, really quickly, presentation, I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time.